Alright, so good afternoon. My name is Jorge Torres. We're going to be doing a pump down procedure on this machine. First step first, what we're going to do is we're going to remove the cover so that we can bypass the switches. The limit switches will trigger if once we start doing the pump down, then you might have a low pressure on one switch, it would trigger and then it turns off the machine, so we will not be able to finish the process of the pump down. So we will bypass the switches so that we'll be able to successfully do our pump down. All right, so right now we've located the pressure switches. They are running in series. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove this our plug here and our wire nut. We're going to remove the wire that goes to the limit switches, and then we're going to apply or jump or bypass our switches and apply constant 24 volts to our coil. The first All right, so our jumper cable is now installed, and we're going to proceed to install our gauges and purge our gauges. At this point, we connected our jumper cable so we can bypass our switches. Next step is we're going to install the gauges, but while I do that, I'm also going to remove the service caps for the suction and the discharge side so that we can be able to proceed with our pump down. Next step, we're going to make sure that all our connections are secure, everything is closed, so we don't have any leaks. We've now installed the high side, and we will now proceed to install the low side or the suction side, as we usually refer to it. Notice that all our ball valves are closed, we're avoiding any leaks. So at this point, we've installed our suction line and a discharge line. So we'll now proceed to open our ball valves so that we can get a reading, and now we will proceed to purge our lines.
Later you can edit it and take that little, like if you're waiting.
The reason why we purge our lines is to make sure that there's no air in the systems. So at this time, we've turned on the machine. Our limit switches are bypassed, so therefore they won't be triggered, because if they get triggered, then the system shuts off and we won't be able to do a successful pump down. We're letting our pressure stabilize a little bit, so we'll run it for about 5 minutes, and then we'll check our pressures. And then once we do that, we'll proceed with shutting down or doing a pump down at this point. All right, so at this point, we've got our machine running. Our pressures have stabilized. Right now, our suction line is at about 75 PSI, and our discharge line is at about 225 PSI. It's run for a few minutes, so it's pretty stable. So I'm gonna get one of my companions here, one of my colleagues, to shut down the machine as we approach zero. The process is we shut down our discharge line, so that way we force all the refrigerant coming from the evaporator to force it into the condenser, and we shut this line, the discharge line, so that way we prevent the fluid from running this way and everything gets trapped in the condenser. So that's the purpose of closing the discharge line first. That way we avoid any fluid going this way, and then the compressor keeps sucking the refrigerant into the condenser. Once we get close to zero on our suction line, then we'll shut down the machine and make sure that both our service valves are closed. So Step one is we will shut down our discharge line, and then we'll get somebody to shut down the machine for us.
Good.
All right, so we have a lot of machines to stabilize again with the pressures. So we're at about 75 for the suction side, and we're at about 225 for our discharge. So once again, I'm going to close down the discharge port first. Once I do that, I will proceed to shut down the suction side until my suction pressure gauge goes to 0, and then we'll turn off the machine. And we'll shut it off just a little bit before 0 because we don't want to create a vacuum, and in case there's a leak, we don't want to introduce any air or impurities into the system at that point. So right below, maybe around 5 psi, we'll shut down the whole system. So we're going to go ahead and proceed to shut down the discharge, and then we'll continue from there. Normally I like to just start them a little bit because it is a little bit of the thread that's in there. It's a little bit long, so I try to start them a little bit just to get a little bit of a advancement with our. All right, so we'll now proceed to close down the suction. Oh, I'm sorry, discharge port, and then we'll move on to the next one. Turn it down. So at this point, we've shut down our valves, and so our refrigerant is now in the condenser. We've been able to manage to get our PSI down to about 25 at the suction side. So we did not create a vacuum. At that point, we did not introduce any air into the system. So right now, our service valves are closed. So now that we have all our refrigerant in our machine or in our condenser, we can now proceed to service anything in the evaporator, whether it be something, electrical, or maybe cleaning the evaporator foil, things of that nature. But now we can service anything outside of the condenser. So at this point now, our pump down procedure is complete. All our refrigerant is in the condenser coil, and so now we will proceed to once again put the system back in service, and we do that by opening up our valves once again, and then at that point restarting our unit, making sure that everything's in order, and removing our jumper cable to reconnect the limit switches. So now we're going to go ahead and open up our ports. We're going to start with our suction port first to allow our refrigerant to start flowing back into our evaporator, and then we'll also open up the discharge port to make sure that the system can now start rotating. We'll also go ahead and remove our jumper cable to reconnect our switches, our limit switches, our low and high, and then we'll go back and remove our pressure gauges as well. So, vamos. So at this point, we've opened up our valves, and as you can see, our pressure gauges are reading once again. So that means our refrigerant has flown back into the system. Before I touch any of this, I'm going to shut down the power to the unit. That way there's no power here, so that we can proceed to remove our jumper cable. Alright, so we've shut down all the electrical power to the unit, and so we will now remove our jumper cable. This is basically our jumper cable. We take this off so that way we can reconnect our limit switches.
New installation?
And I'm gonna make a little fixture here. Our line's getting a little bit. Get a little bit more. There we go. So we have a little bit more to grab onto. Reconnect our limit switches. And just make sure that this cable is wired up secure. So, alright, at this point, everything's connected back. So now we're going to go ahead and turn on the unit back on. Make sure we get our pressure readings and then proceed to remove the gauges. Yes. Alright, so our unit has been running now for a few minutes, and so our pressures are once again stable. We got our 75 and our 225 that we were reading earlier, so everything's already back to normal. So what we're going to go ahead and do is remove the gauges. Step one is we're going to close the ball valve for the discharge line, which is this one. Then we're going to remove our line and put it in our dummy port. And then at that point, we're going to leave. We're going to move our refrigerant. I'm sorry. We're going to move our refrigerant from our suction line, or the red line, into the service line by opening this port. Then we'll purge our suction line, or I'm sorry, not the suction line. We'll purge our service line. And then once we do that, we'll go ahead and proceed to stabilize our system by moving the refrigerant into the suction port. So, step one, we're going to go ahead and close our ball valve for their suction line. And then we're going to go ahead and remove our discharge line service line. So we've now plugged it into our dummy port. I'm going to make sure that my my service line ball valve is closed. Then I'm going to go ahead and open up my valve here, and this allows the refrigerant to flow from our discharge line into our service line. I will now go ahead and proceed to purge our service line. And the reason why we do that is because that allows us to remove any impurities that may have been in our service line before we transferred the refrigerant over. Now at this point, all the refrigerant is basically on this side. We've already purged our service line, so we can go ahead and proceed to move the refrigerant from our service line into the unit itself by opening and closing our suction line. Opening and closing it until we get our pressures to stabilize. At this point, all our systems are now, our gauges, our lines are open, and our gauges are reading the same reading. So we now have a stabilized pressure in our condenser or the refrigerant system. We go ahead and proceed to close our valves, and then I'll go ahead and remove our suction line, service line. Last step is we don't want to vent any refrigerant in the building, so this is where we would go out into the open area and go ahead and remove any service or any refrigerant that may be on our gauges, but we could do that outside of the building. As for now, that basically concludes the pump down procedure, where we were able to remove all the freon or refrigerant from our evaporator into our condenser unit. And then of course open up the valves again so that we can allow the refrigerant to flow once again through the system. And that concludes our video. Thank you.